Elliot Grayson never thought much about death. It was something that happened to other people, distant figures in news reports, old acquaintances mentioned in passing, names carved into cold gray stone. He had always assumed that when his time came, he'd feel it. There'd be a warning, a final moment of clarity, but death had never crossed his mind, not until he saw his own obituary. The day started like any other. Elliot walked the same route he had taken for years. The same coffee shop, the same turn down Main Street, the same quiet shuffle past the community bulletin board. The board was cluttered with familiar postings, lost dog flyers, ads for guitar lessons, local event notices. Nothing ever changed, except today. Today, something was different. A small, black-bordered notice pinned near the center caught his eye. He almost walked past it, almost dismissed it as just another name he didn't recognize. But then his gaze landed on the words. With great sadness, we announce the passing of Elliot Grayson. He froze. The words blurred in front of him, his mind refusing to process them. His name, his exact name. His breath turned shallow as he kept reading. A beloved friend, a man of many talents, gone too soon. His funeral will be held on Saturday at 2 p.m. at Rosewood Cemetery. His stomach twisted. It had to be a mistake, a coincidence, someone else with the same name. Then his eyes dropped to the bottom of the notice. There, staring back at him, was his own photograph. His chest tightened. It wasn't an old picture, not some youthful snapshot from years ago. It was recent. The same photo on his driver's license, the same one he had taken just last year. And it was on a death notice. His own. Elliot ripped the paper from the board, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He scanned the street, half expecting someone to be watching him, waiting for his reaction. But no one was. The world moved around him as if nothing had changed. People walked past, chatting, sipping coffee, living their lives, completely unaware that a dead man was standing among them. He swallowed hard. This had to be a prank, a sick joke, someone messing with him. He pulled out his phone and dialed the first person that came to mind. Mark. Mark had been his best friend for over a decade. If anyone knew what the hell was going on, it would be him. The phone rang once, twice, then a click. A robotic voice greeted him instead. The number you're trying to reach is no longer in service. Elliot's grip tightened on his phone. That didn't make sense. Mark's number hadn't changed in years. He tried again. Same result. A cold sense of unease settled over him. Something was wrong. He needed answers, and there was only one place to get them: his own funeral. The walk to Rosewood Cemetery felt surreal. Every step carried a weight he couldn't explain. He kept checking his reflection in shop windows, half expecting to see nothing staring back. But he was there, alive. Yet, in a matter of hours, people would be gathering to mourn him. When he arrived, the cemetery gates loomed in front of him, slightly ajar. A cold wind rustled the leaves, sending a shiver down his spine. His funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m. It was 1:58. He hesitated. If this was some elaborate joke, he'd find out soon enough. But if it wasn't, a part of him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't supposed to be here. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The cemetery was silent except for the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds hidden in the trees. Elliot moved carefully, his breath shallow, his footsteps muffled against the damp earth. He wasn't sure what he expected. A group of people sobbing around an empty grave? A priest reading off a eulogy for a man who was standing just a few feet away? But as he approached the burial site, his stomach tightened. Because this wasn't just a funeral. It was his. The mourners were gathered near a dark wooden casket, their heads bowed in quiet grief. Some wiped at their eyes. Others murmured among themselves. Elliot's pulse pounded. He knew these people. Mark was near the front, standing stiffly with his hands in his pockets. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept. Next to him was Claire, Elliot's former co-worker. They hadn't spoken in months, but there she was, staring at the casket with a distant expression. His boss, his neighbor, even an old college professor. People who had once been in his life, but had slowly faded into the background. And yet, they were all here, mourning him. Elliot's breath hitched. Did they really believe he was dead? Hadn't anyone questioned this? Hadn't anyone tried to contact him? He clenched his fists. Who sent out this notice? Who planned this? Then, his eyes drifted toward the coffin, a sleek, mahogany casket, polished and surrounded by flowers. A large framed photograph rested beside it, his own face staring back at him. Elliot's chest tightened. This was real, but it shouldn't be. His entire body was screaming at him to walk away, to turn back, to run. But before he could take another step, a voice spoke behind him. "You're not supposed to be here." Elliot froze. His entire body stiffened as he turned. Standing just a few feet away was a man he had never seen before. And yet, there was something familiar about him. Elliot's mouth went dry. The stranger was tall, dressed in a black suit, blending in seamlessly with the mourners. But unlike them, he wasn't grieving. He was watching. "You're not supposed to be here," the man repeated, his voice calm, almost amused. Elliot's heart pounded. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "I think the better question is, who are you?" Elliot's fingers twitched. He swallowed. "I'm Elliot Grayson." The man's expression didn't change. "Are you?" Elliot's stomach twisted. "What kind of question is that?" "Of course I am." The stranger smirked. "Then why are they mourning you?" Elliot had no answer, his hands curled into fists. "I don't know. That's why I'm here." The man took a slow step forward. "Then tell me, what's the last thing you remember?" The question sent a shiver through Elliot's spine. He opened his mouth, then stopped. His mind reeled. He remembered waking up that morning, walking his usual route, seeing the obituary. But before that, his memory felt blurred, like something had been erased. Elliot's chest tightened. He shook his head. "This is ridiculous. I'm alive." The man's eyes darkened. "Are you?" Elliot's breath hitched. Something wasn't right. And deep down, he knew it. Elliot felt his heartbeat in his throat. He was standing in front of his own funeral, speaking to a man who shouldn't exist, while people who once knew him mourned a death that never happened. And yet, the longer he stood there, the more something inside him whispered otherwise. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. "Are you?" His breath came faster. He could feel his mind trying to grasp at something, but every time he reached for it, the memory slipped further away. What was the last thing he remembered before seeing the obituary? What had he done yesterday? Last week? Elliot clenched his jaw. "This is insane," he muttered, mostly to himself. The man watched him carefully. "Denial is a funny thing," he said. "It makes the truth feel optional." Elliot shot him a glare. "And what truth is that?" The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That you've been gone for a long time, Elliot." Elliot wanted to argue, to say something, anything to refute what this man was saying. But before he could speak, something shifted. The priest's voice rose slightly, pulling Elliot's attention back to the funeral. He turned, just as the casket lid slowly creaked open. His breath caught. This wasn't how funerals worked. The casket was supposed to be closed by now. But someone had made a mistake. Or someone wanted him to see. Elliot took an involuntary step forward, his hands trembling. He wasn't sure if he wanted to look, but he had to. He had to know. Slowly, he peered inside, and his world shattered. Elliot staggered back, choking on air, because inside that casket was him. Pale skin, still body, the same sharp jawline, the same neatly combed dark hair. It was him, dead, lifeless, a version of himself that should not, could not, exist. Elliot's entire body locked up. His brain refused to make sense of it. No. The word escaped him in a hoarse whisper. This was a trick, a setup, a lie. It had to be. He turned sharply to the stranger. What the hell is this? The man's expression didn't change. The truth. Elliot's vision blurred. His chest ached. No, he repeated, shaking his head violently. This isn't real. It can't be real. The man exhaled. You always say that. Elliot's breath hitched. His hands trembled as he turned back to the casket, forcing himself to look again. And this time, his dead self opened its eyes. A sharp gasp escaped Elliot's lips. He stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. It was impossible. But those eyes, his eyes, were looking right at him. Staring, seeing, knowing. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the body in the coffin spoke. It's time to wake up, Elliot. Elliot's knees nearly buckled. His head pounded. Everything around him flickered. The funeral, the mourners, the sky itself. Like the world was coming apart at the seams. Elliot clutched his head. What's happening? The stranger exhaled, almost tiredly. You're remembering? Elliot gasped for breath. His thoughts were racing too fast to process. This wasn't just a funeral. It wasn't just a mistake. This was something else. Something much, much worse. And for the first time, Elliot wasn't sure if he wanted to remember. Elliot's world was unraveling. The sky above the cemetery flickered, not like a sunset, not like shifting clouds, but like a dying light bulb. The people around him were no longer solid shapes, but blurred, like smudged ink on an old photograph. And the body in the coffin, his own lifeless reflection, was still staring at him, still speaking. It's time to wake up, Elliot. His breath hitched. He turned wildly to the stranger, the only other thing in this place that felt real. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice shaking. The man didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked expectant. You already know, he said quietly. Elliot clenched his fists. No, I don't. The man sighed, tilting his head slightly. Then let me ask you again, Elliot. His voice lowered, almost gentle. What's the last thing you remember? Elliot's lips parted. His mind recoiled. Because the truth was, he didn't remember. Not clearly. The morning he had woken up, his usual walk, seeing the obituary. Those moments were sharp, too sharp, like details carefully placed in his mind, filling the gaps of something he was never supposed to question. What came before that? What happened before he died? A ringing sound filled his ears, distant, faint, but growing louder. A car horn, headlights, a flash of movement, pain, and then nothing. Elliot's stomach dropped, his knees wobbled. The stranger nodded slowly. You're starting to remember, he murmured. Elliot's hands trembled. I was in an accident, he whispered. The words felt like broken glass on his tongue. I got hit by a car. The man stepped closer. Yes. Elliot's breath came in short, uneven gasps. His chest ached. He clutched his head as more memories clawed their way up from the darkness. It hadn't just been an accident. It had been his accident. He had been crossing the street, his usual route, home. The light had been green. He had the right of way. But the driver, he had seen the car too late. The metal had hit him like a freight train. His body had lifted off the ground. The world had blurred. He had felt the pavement before he even heard the impact. And then, everything had gone dark. Elliot's breath hitched. His pulse roared. He turned back to the coffin, his own lifeless body still watching him. The him inside the casket smiled. And then, in a voice that was also his own, it whispered, "You never left." Elliot staggered back. His entire body felt like it was collapsing inward, suffocating under the weight of what that meant. The funeral, the obituary, the fact that no one had looked for him, that no one had questioned it, because he really had died. He wasn't supposed to be here. Elliot turned desperately to the stranger, his throat tight, his chest aching. "If I'm dead," he rasped, "then why am I still here?" The man watched him carefully. His expression was sympathetic. "Because you haven't accepted it," he said simply. Elliot shook his head violently. "Number no. I don't. I can't." The stranger sighed. "You don't understand, Elliot." His voice was firm now, but not unkind. "This isn't real. It's a construct, a place your mind created to protect itself." Elliot blinked. "What?" The stranger gestured to the funeral, to the mourners, frozen in place like mannequins. "You weren't ready," he explained. "So you built this. A world where you could still exist, still move, still believe you're alive." Elliot's breath stuttered. This wasn't real. He felt sick. His legs felt weak. "Then what happens if I leave?" he whispered. The stranger's eyes darkened. "Then you wake up." Elliot swallowed hard. "And if I stay?" The stranger exhaled. "Then you fade. Eventually this world collapses, and you go wherever it is people go." Elliot's fingers twitched. The choice hung between them like a blade. He could accept the truth. Or he could stay here, trapped in a world that was already crumbling. His eyes flickered back to the coffin. His dead self's smile was gone now. It was just watching, waiting. Elliot took a shaky breath. And then, he made his choice. Elliot stood at the edge of something he couldn't fully comprehend. His mind screamed at him to deny it, to refuse the truth pressing down on him. But the evidence was all around him. The funeral, the mourners who never even looked in his direction, the world flickering like an old, dying film reel, and the body in the coffin, his body. The stranger watched him carefully, as if waiting for him to process the inevitable. "You know what you have to do," the man said quietly. Elliot's hands shook. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice raw. The stranger sighed, stepping closer. "You've already started to, Elliot. Otherwise, you wouldn't be standing here, seeing all of this for what it really is." Elliot looked at the coffin, again, at the stillness inside it. So this was it. This was the end. His life wasn't waiting for him just around the corner. There was no job to go back to, no apartment filled with half-read books and unfinished projects. There was nothing. A sharp ache swelled in his chest. He had spent so much of his life moving through the world without really living in it. And now, he was being asked to let go of it entirely. He swallowed hard. "What if I don't want to?" The stranger didn't flinch. "Then you can stay." Elliot frowned. "Stay?" The man gestured around them. "This place exists because you exist in it. But it won't last forever, Elliot. Eventually, it will unravel. And when it does, you'll go somewhere else." Elliot's blood ran cold. Somewhere else. "What does that mean?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The stranger's expression darkened slightly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this. People who stay too long, they fade." Elliot's stomach twisted. He thought of the funeral, the mourners, the fact that, for all their sorrow, none of them had spoken his name aloud. Would he become one of those lost souls? Someone forgotten, even by the dead? A shiver ran down his spine. Number, he couldn't let that happen. Elliot clenched his fists. Then how do I wake up? The stranger's gaze flickered to the coffin. You already know, he said. Elliot turned slowly. His own lifeless face stared back at him. It was waiting. Elliot took a deep, shuddering breath. He stepped toward the casket. His legs felt heavy, as if the weight of all his choices had been pressed into his bones. With trembling fingers, he reached out. As soon as his hands touched the edge of the casket, the world shattered. A sound like rushing wind filled his ears. The ground beneath him tilted, sending him falling into endless, suffocating darkness. And then, a voice, faint at first, then stronger. Sir? Sir? Can you hear me? Elliot's lungs burned. His body ached. His fingers twitched against something cold and solid. He gasped, and then he woke up. The first thing he saw was a white ceiling. Fluorescent lights hummed above him. Machines beeped in the background. A hospital. His hospital room. His body. Elliot's breath was ragged, his mind spinning. His arms felt like lead, his legs barely responding. But he was here, alive. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his ribs. A nurse appeared beside him, pressing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Easy, she said. You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days. It had only been 3 days. His throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. What happened? The nurse's face softened. You were hit by a car, she explained. You suffered a concussion, some internal injuries. But you're lucky. It could have been much worse. Elliot's mind reeled. The funeral, the stranger, the coffin. Had it all been a dream? Or something else? His fingers tightened around the bed sheets. Before he could process it further, the nurse gave him a small, knowing smile. You had a visitor earlier. Your friend, Mark, I think. He sat with you for a long time. Elliot's breath hitched. Mark? She nodded. He seemed relieved. Elliot swallowed hard. Mark had been at the funeral, mourning him. Did he know what had happened? Did he somehow sense that Elliot had been there, trapped in a place between life and death? Elliot had so many questions. But for the first time in a long time, he had something even more important. A second chance. He wasn't going to waste it. What would you do? If you found yourself standing at your own funeral, what would you do? Would you fight to come back? Or would you let go, accepting the unknown? Let me know in the comments. What do you think really happened to Elliot? And if this story made you think, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't death. It's realizing you almost let go of life.